I apologize in advance if I get too worked up. I'm not mad at you. I'm just mad at the situation in our country. It's just it seems like an epidemic of health.
You're right to be concerned about it. More Americans should be. It's just not a natural, normal, or good state to have as many sick people as we do. Over half the nation is sick with a chronic disease, diabetes, obesity, heart disease, cancer. Most of those caused by our food. And so bad that lifespans are declining in the United States. We're last in the world among the 20 most developed countries in terms of lifespan. But maybe most disturbing of all is how sick our children are. And so, it used to be called, when I was younger, adult onset diabetes because there was type 1, the type you're born with. But then later in life, some people had chronic illnesses that gave rise to a form of diabetes. Now we had to change the name to type 2 diabetes because it's so common in children. 20% of our children are obese. And another disease that only used to occur late in life, a fatty liver disease, often associated with chronic alcoholism. In the last decade, the fastest growth has been in our children. And that's all because of the food we're being sold.
Yeah, I saw that. I worked in the schools for 17 years, and the kids, they just, I mean, they were just eating garbage. It was really sad to see. And yeah, you see all these kids that are obese. I mean, I don't know what their blood work is like, but I can't imagine that it's good when they're walking around with all that extra weight. And it's just sad. And I think it reinforced one of the articles you sent me about the gap between, which is the thing is really interesting because I think that's something that hopefully will get people on the left to join in this revolution, is that the rich people are living longer than the poor people. The gap is widening because poor people are eating the food that's cheaper because they're just trying to survive, and this is the food that's killing people.
Yeah, there is a gap. It's the diseases that we're talking about, these chronic diseases, death rates in every area. It's hardest on the lowest income Americans, but more than just the very lowest, really, even many middle class people. Of course, people in all groups are sick, but those that you mentioned are sicker. And it's
Right.
because the cost, often we think of cost as what we see in the food store when we go to purchase something. But another equally important cost is the time it takes to prepare the food and the skill and knowledge it takes to prepare the food. So increasing what our food companies provide is not only tasty, which they should, food, more affordable, but also convenient, time saving, that
Yeah.
you can go right from the box to the microwave to your plate. And often those foods are designed and produced in a way that, if eaten as designed, will make us sick.
Yeah, I mean, and also I feel like I have the time and the energy, and I took a nutrition class in college. It was a long time ago, but I got an A in that, and I feel like it's an interest for me, and I can go through and read the ingredients and then Google it. I mean, I have a lot more time on my hands than the average, working mom or whatever that's just got to like grab the food quickly and doesn't have time to research every ingredient and chemical that's in their food and say, is this good? Is this bad? Is there a way, something that you recommend for people who are on a budget, like a cheap way to eat healthy?
It's hard, and my work, as you know, has been mostly in senior positions in government. And so
Mhm.
my view is that, fortunately, we have a Food and Drug Administration, a Department of Agriculture, that have programs that were created to ensure that our food is safe. Often people think about that in terms of maybe bacterial contamination, acute illnesses that can occur. But the law doesn't make that distinction. The law says that substances added to food may not be injurious to health. So not, there's a pretty high bar there for companies to make sure that the food they're selling doesn't make us sick. Unfortunately, the government's not doing its job ensuring that these foods don't. Yes, there are things we can do individually. We can read the food label that I was helped design. Those things matter. There are steps you can take. But really, the most important step you would need to take is to scratch cook all your food. And that is more than most Americans are able to do. And so it's really not a fair requirement request to say you can do that. Those who want to do that, absolutely, and we should support that and enable it to happen. But those who, through their circumstances, have no choice but to rely on what's called ultra processed food to eat should be able to do so with not worrying about their health. That is the law, and that needs to be enforced. That really is the number one strategy, and your listeners and others need to demand of their government, of the elected officials, to make sure that food companies produce food that we can eat every day and not get sick.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing I think that I get into arguments with people because I don't feel like the food is safe. I mean, yes, it's safe in terms of bacteria and E. coli for the most part. I mean, yeah, they have the occasional flare up of those kinds of things, but I'm thinking more like long term. Like, and I feel like that's the thing that honestly, like, we don't know a lot of the chemicals that are in our food now. We don't know the long term effects of these, right? Because some of them have just been approved recently. I mean, I can't keep up with all the different things that are in there. But and then and then it's hard to figure out. You read things, oh, this is bad, oh, and then but the FDA says it's okay. So it's like there's a lot of confusion. Even if you're trying to research the internet and trying to research these chemicals, you'll see conflicting things. Like I don't know, I saw an article the other day, 12 dirty dozens, like BVO. I think that is something that now they've officially or tried to ban it. I don't know if it's officially banned yet, but I think it was in Mountain Dew. It's like
Mhm.
brominated vegetable oil or something.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one thing, it's not that far off. So as I mentioned before, our children are getting sick. So these aren't things that you're eating today, and you don't have to worry about it for 20, 30 years. I think what should be an alarm for all of us, that it strikes us not that many years later, the fact that 20% of our children are obese, type 2
Right.
diabetes, right? So it's not that far off. Maybe it's not right away, but
Right.
it's within a few years. And so that should be a concern. The chemicals you mentioned, I think the number one problem with our diet is that we are overeating, and that ultra processed foods, the studies that the National Institutes of Health and others have done, found that when you feed people a diet matched for nutrients, so the same amount of vitamins, minerals, but also things that people worry about, rightly, salt, added sugar, saturated fat in their food, that if you serve that made by a chef in their facility versus the foods that were sold by companies in our stores, those who ate those highly processed foods ate an extra 500 calories a day. So the number one way our food is making us sick, not so much that the chemicals may cause a cancer later. We have good systems in place to test for that. But what we don't test for is this food going to cause you to overeat and gain weight and become obese? We're not testing chemicals at all for that. And that's how companies appear to be using them.
Yeah, explain what is your definition of that? Because this is something that I guess is confusing for some people.
Yeah, no, it is. And it's because it's brand new. It wasn't used until a few years ago. Some colleagues in Brazil came up with it to describe another way of describing food. So we're all used to describing, of course, food. We know about it as fruits, vegetables, bread, grains, protein, meat. We're all familiar with calling food by its food name, but we're also all pretty now at this point familiar with the reductionist from that step down to the chemical nutrients. So we think about it not as food items of fruits, vegetables, meat, grains. We think about it as protein, fat, carbohydrates, vitamins, minerals. That was a discovery that happened quite a while ago, but was Nobel Prize worthy because it enabled us to prevent maybe 1 billion deaths globally due to hunger. So understanding that it wasn't just food, but if we made sure people had enough of these individual nutrients, we could avoid these states of malnutrition, of hunger, of micronutrient, vitamin, mineral, protein, the deficiencies, malnutrition. We solved that problem, which was fabulous. But it didn't explain the chronic disease. And as we've kept trying to rely on the nutrient approach to explain, well, why though is it causing diabetes? Why though is it causing cancer? The nutrients didn't seem to explain it. So this group took another approach and they ignored the nutrients and looked at the level of processing. They came up with a system they call NOVA, N-O-V-A, V as in Victor, and they broke food into four categories, which I'll briefly explain. The first are these raw ingredients we're all familiar with, food. So the fruits and vegetables, grains that grow that should be at the base of our food. The next are what they refer to as culinary ingredients, things like the oil, salt, sugar, things that you would find in your kitchen and would use in taking the raw food ingredients and making them into dinner. The third category is what they call minimally processed food. And really, it's just taking those first two categories, putting together and get that. So you don't have the chicken, you don't have the tomato, but you have the cow, but you have the chicken Parmesan on your plate. And so you've taken the raw ingredients, you've taken the culinary ingredients, and you've produced this minimally processed dish. But then there's the fourth category, what they deemed ultra processed food. There are a lot of ways to think about it. One way is to describe it is that it is something you couldn't make in your kitchen. And if you took the package and the ingredients are required by a law to be on the package, if you looked at that list of ingredients and then started to take that down from your shelf, well, you'd find that most of the ingredients there you don't have. In fact, many of them you can't pronounce and have no idea what they are. And so I think what Americans don't see, which they should see, is how much our food has changed and how, where is the food in our food? Let me give you one more example, which, really stuck in my mind. When I was at the Food and Drug Administration, your listeners, there's a product, but V8 juice. I don't know if you recall V8 juice, Chuck, but a vegetable.
Yeah, my
juice.
parents used to drink that. It was disgusting. It looked gross, smelled gross.
No, it looked gross, right? I had the same reaction to it. But when I was at FDA, we got to, Campbell's invited us out to see their facility. And it was actually called V7 because the 8 was tomato juice, and they had a whole different factory and process to make the tomato juice. But what we got to see is the 7 other vegetables that go in. And it was really reassuring in the sense that we pulled up to this factory and there was a long line of oversized dump trucks filled to the brim with all of the odd shaped produce you would never see in your grocery store. So carrots that were bigger than I could put on this screen and little tiny ones, but all the rejects got gathered up that you can't sell in the store, and they were sent there and made into juice. And then you're right, the final product may not have been something you want, but you'd see what goes into it is all food. If you go into an ultra processed food facility today, you'll see powders, sludges. There is nothing you will see there that you recognize as food. And so what's happened is our food industry has figured out how to take some cheap out of the carbohydrate class, often grain class, and they really strip it down. It starts as a form of a plant, but they've stripped it down to the point that even the plant walls and structure of the plant are gone. And this sort of framework that's left, they then layer onto it all sorts of flavors, smells, other things to create this food. They add vitamins, minerals to it. But you have to ask yourself, is it food or fiction? It really is fiction. It's not food. And yet that's what makes up, unfortunately, the bulk of our diet. These ultra processed foods, no discussion was taking place. There was no government program to encourage this. But today it makes up almost 3/4 of what we find in our food stores and makes up over half of most Americans' diets and even more in children's diets.
Well, yeah, and I think, did you ever see Food Incorporated or part 1 or 2? Those are great documentaries for people who are just even remotely interested in this topic. I recommend those. But I think one of the things they said, and I just rewatched it yesterday to get some notes for this interview, but one of the things they said that was I forgot, it was so interesting. They said corn and soy, 90% of foods contain one of these 2 ingredients. And even the animals are eating corn. Even the fish they're finding a way to feed corn to fish.
Well, and again, over time, we faced different primary problems. And as I said, at one point, it was make sure enough people in the world, everyone had enough to eat, that we didn't have 1 billion people die. And so that was a big priority. And so, we created a food system to meet that challenge. Another part, and this is really is somewhat uniquely American, which is how cheap we want our food. So
Mm,
if you think about it back well before my time and your time, every family had to ask itself the question, where we're going to get our food, who's growing it amongst us. Someone needed to grow it. And that would be, something for someone to have a career as a farmer and produce farm on their land. Interesting, even today, 90% of farmers aren't able to make a living just on what they farm. They have to do other things. And at one time, that was the case for all Americans, is one of the things we had to do is grow the food we eat. Now,
hmm.
you fast forward today, and we rely on less, I didn't have that conversation in my family, who's going to grow the food we're going to eat. Less than 1% of us produce the food that we all need to eat, less than
Right.
1%. And not only that, that's not enough. Not only to say that, we want you to produce all of our food. We're not as grateful as we should. It's super hard work. Most people don't know who's the farmer who's producing their food, or ever say thank you to them, which is a problem, because they work terribly hard. But in addition to that, Americans demand, not only do we want this food, we want it to be cheap. And so we pay less for our food than any other country in the world. Less than 10% on average of Americans' income goes to our food, which is much lower than any other country. And I'll give you one example of that. We produce some of the best seafood, particularly shrimp, in the world, in our Gulf, other areas. But it's hard to find in our stores, because most of that is quickly bought up and shipped overseas, where they value the quality of that shrimp. What
Hmm.
Americans put before everything else is they want it to be cheap. I was just reading in the news
Yeah.
how Red Lobster is going out of business.
I saw
They're
that
going out
too.
of business because Americans wanted, all they could eat shrimp. Well, how did they get all they eat shrimp? They didn't get it by, harvesting the shrimp in our coast, because it would cost too much. They got it from, Southeast Asia, where we send our shrimp because the people there demand higher
Oh.
quality shrimp, but then they produce it themselves. It's cheap, poor quality, but we want it because it costs less. And, part of it is a serious problem, in that we have a lot of low income people who can't afford enough to eat always. And so we do need to be sensitive about our food price, but all of it also overall across society, Americans put the cost of the food first. And as a result, we sort of get what we demand, which is a
Hmm.
cheaper, lower cost food, but also of much lower quality.
Yeah, well, because another part of America, which again, I'm a capitalist. I think it's great to make money, but the top four food corporations control 80% of the market, or I don't know if that statistic is up to date. It might be slightly different now, but basically, it's a few handful of companies controlling a majority of this food, and it used to be hundreds or thousands of farms giving our food. Now it's just like I think 130 or something, or factories or whatever. I can't remember the exact statistic, but it's like or sorry, 13, I think. Isn't it 13 giant like factories produce a majority of the food in this country? I mean, and it's kind of scary too, because if something goes wrong, which I think we saw during the pandemic, there were some issues with the food supply. I mean, we could run out of food real quickly, right?
Well, people don't have to worry about running out of food overall, though it can happen. And it happened during the pandemic with infant formula. And exactly for the reason you described, the amount of consolidation brought the number of really large, viable infant formula companies that we relied on to just a few. And so when one of them had a problem and had to shut down a major factory, that resulted in a decrease of supply. Now, in the scale we work on as a country, that's exacerbated because people worry about it. I remember
Mhm.
visiting a nephew. They had a big store. They have the means to do this. They opened up a closet. They had an infant, was filled with infant formula. I go, well, what do they're just worried about it. They have the means. The mom was able to stay on the internet all day, track it down all across the country and find some. So those two factors together, the shutting down of a large factory and a consolidated industry, but also a reasonable public response, especially if you have an infant. I'm worried about it. And so all of a sudden, supply dipped a little, demand shot way up. People started, buying as much as they could, and that was a problem. I raise it because the heart of it is there's a need for trust. We could have solved the problem if everyone sort of trusted more in the government and said that, look, we're going through this period, and together, you want to make sure you have enough infant formula. We're going to help you do that, but don't hoard it. But people don't. They look out for themselves. I get it. And that was the result. So yes, it does happen. The consolidation does happen. It's not quite as extreme as you described, but it is this notion again that we have what we call sort of commodity crops, soybean, corn, wheat, some of these large, almost industrial scale crops. Is okay. It helps feed the world. Those industries are really profitable, but it's not necessarily best for consumers. The farms we rely on for our produce aren't that same way. That's much more diverse and not quite as consolidated, in part by the nature of the product. But we need to, grow more produce so people
Yeah.
can eat it. But it really begins with people demanding it. I think we can meet that need. It's just that not enough people demand it today.
Yeah. Wait. So explain this to me though, because I didn't research this, but I did. I do. Now that you bring up the infant formula, because I remember that story, and I was trying to figure out at the time, and maybe this is misinformation. I don't know. But what I read something about how there's only, again, it's one of the similar kind of things. There's only like 2 or 3 companies that make infant formula that is up to FDA standards in the US, but there's tons that do it in Europe. And that was confusing to me because I thought Europe banned more ingredients in our foods than America. They seem like they have a stricter thing about chemicals and ingredients in our food. So is that like a kind of a monopoly? Is there some like some shady things going on with the food companies, kind of like making it harder to get approved to make infant formula so they control the market, or what is the story there?
Well, there is a consolidation, and that is a problem. My experience in the senior positions I've had across government, it's not so much of a conspiracy; it's just a marketplace sort of being unfettered. I'm a fan. I think capitalism works as a system, but I'll describe a difference. Back in the 1920s or so earlier, there was what was called sort of rough and tumble capitalism, and I think that's what you're seeing again in America, and what you're describing is where the market, we put so much faith in the market, and there's so few guardrails in terms of how companies behave, that they behave in extreme ways that give rise to the term rough and tumble, because you don't want to be in rough and tumble, but that's what we experience more and more as Americans. So what happened for the government is trying to provide for they're setting standards for infant formula. It's true the U.S. have slightly stricter standards because there was an experience in our time where we did a little bit better than some other countries because we had tougher standards to ensure our infant formula is safe. So that was a part of the problem, that the barrier of becoming an infant formula company that you have to do is higher here, and so fewer companies go in it. But then it was exacerbated again in a well-meaning step. We have a program that I helped oversee at USDA, the Women, Infant, and Children's WIC program. And in order to keep the cost of that program down, as taxpayers, we're always demanding that a government, costs go down, and to keep the WIC costs down, they created a competition in each state where the infant formula companies would compete for the lowest price, and then they would win an exclusive contract to sell infant formula in that state. And so those rules, which companies supported because it enables them to grow, and a few to be successful. And, it's always funny, I find that corporations claim they want an unfettered marketplace. But when I was at FDA, we seized some orange juice that was labeled fresh, which wasn't. And it was Citrus Hill, they called it fresh orange juice. We were egged on to do it by their competitors. It wasn't that we were trying to do it. People want, corporations all the time really do benefit from the government rules and try to put in place rules and policies that benefit them. And I think my point is that when people feel like, well, the government's a problem, I think more often it's the companies who are sort of egging the government on in a certain way. And I think that's what happened with infant formula. A few powerful companies sought to get rid of their competitors and benefit consumers. But the result was we were left with just a couple of large companies. And then when a problem occurred, the combination of a decrease in supply, but an uptick in demand, because people were concerned, rightly, that there'd be enough formula for their children, ended up causing a serious crisis where you could go into a store and the shelves where infant formula should have been were empty. And that should never have happened.
Well, yeah, and you mentioned the corporations and the government. That's an interesting relationship. And they touched on this a little bit in Food Incorporated, where they with Monsanto, and they have a staff that investigates people stealing their seeds because they have these Roundup Ready soybeans that they've developed this special formula. But the problem is that Monsanto has ties to both the Bush and the Clinton administration. So they said, this was the movie's 2008, so I'm sure Obama and Trump and Biden too. What is that? Because I think that's very admirable that you told me, and that you do not go into the corporate world after being in the government. You go to academia, which I think that's much more respectable. What is your thought on people that do that? I mean, isn't that a conflict of interest if you work for a food corporation, then you go in the government, or you're in the government and then later you're working for the food corporation that you were supposed to be policing? Isn't that a conflict of interest? I mean, it's definitely a bad look at the very least.
Yeah, I think it is a conflict of interest. There are some rules in place, but they're just simply not effective. So after I've had a senior government position, there's a rule that says that I can't go back and lobby the people I work for a year, 2 years. It depends on the administration. It's a step to address what you're talking about. But I can go work for that corporation tomorrow and teach the people there how to use what I know and the people I know to get what they want, even though I'm not myself directly lobbying. So I'm not lobbying. I'm not meeting with the people I used to meet with, but I can tell the people I'm now working for, this is the person you need to meet with. Here's what I know about them. Here's how to get a meeting with them. And now you can do it. And so I'm following the rules, but it's the companies are benefiting from it. Again, I think we have capitalism can be great. As I said, I think there was way back, they had what was called this rough and tumble capitalism. We moved away from it for many years and created a system that much better balanced government oversight of corporations. But corporations that use their money, used all the different strategies in terms of getting people to worry more about government than them. And as a result, I think we're really back as bad of rough and tumble capitalism as we saw in the past is returning today increasingly. And I think this movement of people back and forth from government, I mean, some of it is useful. You want to learn from each other, but I don't think there are enough safeguards in place. And part of that is it's tough. So, for example, particularly in my field in nutrition, that all Americans should be concerned about is the government really doesn't support nutrition research. We have a National Institutes of Health. We rely on them to come up with treatments for disease, something we all want. But if you zoom out at a high level, Chuck, and ask, what's going on in America today? Why are we so sick? And you say, all right, well, let's explore that question. Well, what are the biggest industries in America? Well, food is one of our biggest industries, $1 trillion industry. What is the net result of our food industry? Well, it makes people sick. It really does.
Yeah.
And then what's even a bigger
you talked
industry?
about low food costs, but I'm going, well, yeah, but somehow they're making a massive profit because I think
because they use such
cereal.
They
cost carbohydrates. Because I had a buddy who, this guy who's making this documentary called Food Lies, and he has a farm and they sell beef and beef products, and he said there's no profit. I was like, well, what if you raise the price? He's like, it doesn't matter. You can't make money selling meat.
Well, it's harder, right? Food, there's a very small margin. And the cheapest way to make food is the way they increasingly do, which is they use some very cheap commodities like corn, soy, and they use just sort of not even the whole structure. They reduce it in a way and process it in a way that provides the bare framework for that. And then they add all these flavors, tastes, other additives to sort of make it end up being like food in the package. But what I was saying before is, so that's a big industry, but even a bigger industry is what's supposed to be our healthcare industry, which is really just a sick care industry. And so if you zoom out at a really high level, we have this enormous industry that feeds us, that has the net result of making us sick, and then hands us off to this other even bigger industry, health, that's really sick care and produces treatments to treat it. Now, when I give you that higher level context, because then you go to our National Institutes of Health, and we have institutes on cancer, heart disease, diabetes. These are the institutes that are working to come up with the treatments to help us when we're sick. Absolutely, we want that. I'm so grateful. People, relatives, others, friends who've been saved by these drugs and discoveries. We want to have them, but the truth is, we can't afford them if everyone is sick. We just need a lot fewer
Right.
sick people. So we need the Institute of Nutrition at NIH to make sure we learn that, so we can when God forbid you become sick with one of these diseases, even though you've tried to we have systems to prevent them. We have the treatments ready to go for you. But for most people, they don't have to live through all of this sickness and suffering and strains on your finances because of it. But we don't have that. And so, because the
Yeah.
National Institutes of Health don't fund our nutrition research, it's less than 5% of its budget. When I'm in academia, a lot of it's academia, but a lot of institutions depend on food companies to help fund their work. And
Right.
you'll see it. It's the chair of this company, the professor of that company.
That's what I try to explain to people, and I get called a conspiracy theorist. I'm like, if you follow the money, it's
Well,
usually
it's a different kind of conspiracy. It's not that
yeah,
someone's planning this particular way or have this
right.
nefarious plan. No one's that smart to make it turn out that way. It's just this idea of rough and tumble capital. You just let the money go where it's going to go.
Yeah.
You don't set any guardrails. You don't hold people accountable. You just let the money flow where it's going to flow. And a lot of people get hurt in that system, and that's what we're seeing
Yes.
today.
Well, and I think in terms of things that the government could control, I definitely think that was interesting when the Obamacare stuff came out. I was like, oh, okay, is there? I don't remember a piece of it that was preventative care, and that was really upsetting to me. And then I remember like during the pandemic, they never talked about being healthy. They never said like, hey, one of the best ways that you can help fight COVID is if you go to the gym, you work out, you get sunshine, you eat healthy, you keep a healthy weight. Like none of these things are very rarely talked about. And I feel like that could be a huge thing. And at the very least, the government can control government food, right? Like school lunches. I mean, you said that you think they got better.
Well,
I
they
don't
did
know.
get better. No,
Did
they're
they?
actually they are now. I'll give you a measure. So the government has something. Some of your listeners might be familiar with the dietary guidelines of America. So it's something that our departments of agriculture and health work on every 5 years or so, and come up with a list of what people should overall, eat and how much. I think you're familiar in the past. It used to be result in, it's meant more for a professional audience to help them understand what people should eat, and then it's translated to a lay audience through a system that USDA usually develops. In the past, it was known as the food pyramid, and we got rid
Oh,
of
I got
that
some
when.
issues with that one. Yeah.
Yeah, no, well, we got rid of it when I was at the Department of Agriculture. Tom Vilsack, who's been open about struggling with his own weight over his life, said, I'm looking at this pyramid. You guys oversee it. Tell me how I'm supposed to use it. It's not helping me. And so we got rid of it. I said, the good news, Tom, is that you can get rid of it and replace it. So we replaced it with something called My Plate. Less people are familiar with that. It hasn't been out as many years, but it really just shows you what your plate should look like. And it shows that half your plate should be fruits and vegetables, which is a wake up call right away for most people. I know it was for the secretary. When we showed him our final design, he looked at it for a second, studied it, and said, oh shit, my plate looks nothing like that. And what he meant was his plate, the protein piece, dominated the entire plate, and the vegetables and things were off to the side. And so, the government can do a better job, needs to do a better job, and needs to fund the medical and nutrition research that will allow us to answer more questions. So, for example, I mentioned ultra processed food. We have studies showing that it's probably a large driver of how we've become so fat as a nation, why we're have so much obesity, why that chronic disease has spread the way it has. But we don't know exactly why. We could find out in a year or two if the National Institutes of Health would make it a priority, but they don't.
But
And in
don't you
part,
yeah.
again, I don't think it's a conspiracy and that someone's thinking this up in a back room, but it has the result because food companies make more money selling
Yeah.
the kind of food they do, and then
Well,
are
yeah, and I don't think the food companies are going, "Hey, let's kill Americans," but they're just saying, "How can we
how do I
make
make the most
money?"
money?
And that just has a side effect of
Right. And so
Typically,
it's
a
a
lot
simple
of time.
solution, Chuck. Our FDA, and they already have the authority to do this, need to go meet with the food companies and say, absolutely, taste, cost, and convenience need to be three of the top four things you use when you design a food. And food, probably number one, has to be delicious. No one wants to change that. But there's a fourth criteria that's in the law that we're charged with enforcing. And that's why we're here meeting with you today, which is that you need to be able to eat the food every day and not get sick.
Yeah.
If it's meant to be eaten every day, I'm not talking about a dessert or
No,
candy or
yeah.
something, but
There's
food that,
yeah.
the breakfast cereals we eat are a great example of that. If
Mm.
children eat those, I mean, go into the grocery store, look at the child section of the cereals, which many of them are, and you just wonder what is going on here. Why are we serving our children essentially candy for breakfast and chocolate cereals and things like that?
Yeah.
The government just has to say, look, guys, absolutely taste, cost, convenience, but just you need to do the study to show people can eat this every day and not get sick. And if that's not the case, you need to adjust how you design the food so people can eat it every day.
Yeah. Well, I mean, going back to the school lunches though, I mean, I'm still
Yeah,
because
so
I
let me
want
tell you
to
about the
see
school
what
lunches. I started to tell you that. I'll finish it. So there is this dietary guidelines. That's why I brought it up. And so the government has, as a metric called the healthy eating index. It's a 0 to 100 score. It's just as you think of a 0 to 100 score. So the government says if you score a 90 or above, you have an A 88, right? And if you're below a 60, you get an F. And so it shows you, and that's a grade that says, how are you doing and following these dietary guidelines we've come out with that we've shown through the science are the ones that will keep you healthiest. Well, the overall American score, unfortunately, is a 58. So we fail. And that's not shouldn't be a surprise to anyone because look how sick we are. Right. So if
Mhm.
you have a failing score, you're probably sick. And they are. So that's why over half of Americans have diabetes or pre-diabetes. Almost half have obesity. And that's right. So that matches the score. We have that score. You would expect that. Now, when I was at USDA, one of the top things we were charged to do by the Congress was to develop new standards for the school meal program. It hadn't been done in decades. And so we went out and measured the healthy eating index score for schools, and it was the average American score of 58, a failing score. So we put in place new standards that, first of all, kicked fast food restaurants out of schools, set nutrition standards, made sure that more fruits and vegetables were served, importantly, made sure that more whole grains were served in school. And we went back 3 years after we put the new standards in place and measured the health eating index score of school meals again, and it had gone up to an 82 in just 3 years. So it shows you how it's not that hard. The Department of Agriculture, not everyone, FDA doesn't have tools quite like that, but the Department of Agriculture has extraordinary tools and resources and was able to change school meal scores from a failing 58 to a respectable 82 in just 3 years by creating those new standards. Now, how delicious that is, that's a whole separate question. It sounds like I didn't have this, but I visited hundreds of schools around the country that do have this, where they've hired chefs or work with chefs, scratch cook their meals, and produce just delicious food for lunch. The problem is that a lot of schools can't afford to do that. A lot of schools were told to get rid of their kitchens and use that space for other things, so they don't have kitchens.
Mm.
Indeed, there's a book, Salt, Sugar, Fat, that author Michael Moss, an investigative reporter, wrote that I'd recommend to you. And he describes the dawn of the ultra processed food era in America. And here's an anecdote that he found through his investigative reporting. As the big food companies started producing this food, they wanted to, figure out one side, how do we market it, but who's standing in our way? And they found out that there were sort of two groups that were standing in their way. And one of them was all of these school lunch ladies, the school food service professionals who were producing scratch cooked meals for our kids when they could be buying these new highly processed
Mm.
products. And so they had the female executives in their firm join the school boards in those schools and had them under the argument of saying we're fighting for our girls. We're giving them, we want them to have, we don't want them being homemakers when they grow up, and they shouldn't be. They should have other things. But they kind kind of conflated it all together that said we shouldn't be teaching
Oh,
our kids how to cook meals. We should be teaching them other things. Whereas the right answer
oh.
was that it was wrong to limit just girls to these cooking
Sure.
classes.
No,
They
I have
should have
a
been open to
yeah.
everyone,
There's a
right?
lot of that's one of the most popular professions
Yeah,
when I
now
went
it
to
should have been.
schools
So they
is
should have
boys
kept
wanna be
that.
a chef. So,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. No,
the lunches that I saw were like, I mean, this isn't like, and I get like you wanna have a cheat meal or something, but this was like every day. It was pizza, burgers, nachos, and then yeah, one thing that's new that more recently, I don't know if this was your work or somebody, they added you have to take a serving of fruits or vegetables. But what the kids do is they take a handful of carrots and then they throw them at me, is what they
yeah.
do every time. It was like hardly any kids actually ate the fruits and vegetables.
Well, some of that does happen, and food waste in schools has always been a problem. But again, that's why science is important. You go out, these points when you raise them, we refer to them as sort of hypotheses
Yeah.
in academia. And so people all the time, let's sit down and think about, well, what do we think's going on out there, particularly from what you're describing as sort of anecdotal observation. So let's go out
Mhm.
there, look what we see, what's happening, and make a point like you just did. What we're seeing here, kids are throwing the carrots at each other. Is that what's really going on everywhere? Did we just see that here today? And so we go out and measure that. And what we found is that plate waste has always been a problem in the school meal program. It comes with the age of the kids in part. And so we measured that and showed that before the before the standards, after the standards, plate waste didn't go up at all. And so, yes, there's been a problem with kids throwing food. They did it before. They're still doing it today.
Right, but I'm
But
saying the bigger
overall,
part was that they're not that they're not eating the fruits and vegetables, that's bad, but the true meal was like, I mean, it was like hot dogs, hamburgers, nachos. It was
well,
never
some are doing that. Some have
yeah.
changed, and the
Some
schools
see,
keep
that's good.
fighting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
like for
think what
example,
would
we
be
said, well, you have to put more vegetables, right,
yeah.
on the plate as you described. Well, then people have pizza companies in their districts, both Republicans and Democrats, and some of the even Democrats who fought for the bill, it was their bill. Some of them actually came back to us then after they just fought for it, and we congratulated them for giving this, and they said, we have a pizza company in our district, and they want to
Uh,
count the tomato sauce as a vegetable. We think you should do that. Well, where does
uh,
that come? That's because in our country, it costs so much money to get elected that even um, the most sincere
yeah,
of our politicians still have to spend too much time raising money. And who funds it? It's corporations. And that is
sad.
a big number one problem. If people
Yeah.
want conspiracies to worry about in
Right.
our country, the number one is that our courts, our highest courts, have decided to treat corporations as people and give them the same rights as we as individuals have. We the people have these rights, a right of freedom of speech, for example, and the courts have said that that includes the contributions you make to political campaigns, and for both super rich people and corporations. And so they can now put billions of dollars behind individual candidates, and we don't get to know because it's their sort of freedom of speech. And that's where, it's sort of a conspiracy has happened, which is corporations have sought through the courts to amass even more power than they've ever had, which has led to the return of this kind of rough and tumble capitalism.
Yeah, they're getting these government contracts, and then it's hard to because I think an easy solution to the kid lunch thing. I mean, you could just do something like Chipotle, kind of similar, like where you have like beans, rice, meat, and salsa. Something very simple ingredients, and maybe kids get to pick how they want to put it together. But I mean, just have like wholesome ingredients. Like I don't know, yeah, everything's just processed. That I don't know if they just put it into some sort of microwave oven or whatever, but I mean, it was
Well,
just
it's
it was
it's
out of a
it's
package.
when my kids were younger, when we would visit a school, one of the first things I wanted to see was their cafeteria and talk to the principal about that. And what I usually encountered was a principal that was under so much pressure around reading and math, and
Mhm.
it just wasn't on their list
Sure.
to worry
But
about
don't see,
what's.
my theory is always that if the kids were healthier physically, that they would be mentally better to engage in the school day, and the test scores would actually rise if you fed them healthier foods. I don't know. I just posted this thing. I don't know if you saw this study about with rats, where they fed rats one just normal rat food or whatever, and then the other rat got the American diet, high in fat, high in sugar, and then they put them in this bowl of water, and they had to swim to find the land. And the rats with the American diet couldn't find they couldn't figure it out. And so they were saying that Alzheimer's is a diabetes of the brain, which is this really fascinating, I thought.
Well, I mean, you're right, and it's not. We don't need rats. We know in children. What you said is absolutely true. That
Yeah.
kids who get better, healthier diets do better in school, and yet we make it hard, not only in terms of the facilities and not providing adequate facilities. I mean, your listeners should know that literally thousands of schools across the country do provide these kind of home cooked meals with people who, whether there's a chef consulting with them or actually in the program. The Department of Agriculture has programs to encourage chefs to work with schools to produce meals. So there are some amazing, really kind of scratch cooked meals out there. But then there are others where the administrators of the schools are overwhelmed and hire essentially a large food service company that services these highly processed packaged foods. And because the government's not doing its job policing the quality of those foods in terms of their relation to overeating, our kids are getting sick with these diseases, and our school meals, despite the new standards, are not yet as healthy as they need to be. And then you're right, it ends up, not only aren't they not healthy, but they end up not doing as well.
Right.
And it's not only just the food. We reduce another equally big problem is we reduce the time kids have to eat the food to, there used to be a lunch hour and a lunch 30 minutes, and now it's often less than that once you wait in line. And there just really isn't enough
True,
time
yeah.
to
There's a
eat.
long
And
line for
so
those things. Yeah. What about the like because I think you talked about this before about how we banned cigarettes for kids, which looking, you speak about that now, people be like, well, yeah, of course kids shouldn't eat or smoke cigarettes. But what if we took a similar approach to childhood obesity and banning some of these junk food items for kids, or at least putting a warning label on it or something?
No, that's a great point, and I'm glad you brought it up, Chuck. Because I did when I worked at the Food and Drug Administration, we regulated tobacco, and you're right. The reason we decided to do it is because when we stepped back and looked at what was killing Americans, tobacco was the number one by quite a bit then. And so, though the FDA hadn't done so in the past, it had authority, and so we set out to do that. And in the end, Congress agreed with us, passed a law, and now there is a Center for Tobacco at FDA, and we regulate smoking. And Americans should be super proud about that, because when we began that work, about a third of adults smoked, about a quarter of kids smoked, and as I said, it was a leading cause of death. Today, less than 2% of American youth smoke. Less than 2%. Took more than 20 years to have that happen, but we succeeded.
Does that include vaping though? Because I know that's a big
So
trend.
vaping is an interesting thing. We should not allow vaping, mainly because if you the key to the strategy in reducing smoking was we reviewed the industry's own documents to understand how they created all these smokers, and learned that they figured out that I don't know if I don't smoke. I don't know if you've ever tried it, but there's not a lot going for it, right? It smells bad, you get sick. It's just not a product that would encourage you to try it again if you tried it out once. But they hire these ad agencies, and indeed we found their oral history in the nation's Smithsonian Museum, and they talked about how they normalized smoking, and they sort of either invented or built upon ideas of product placement, celebrity endorsements, all of these things to kind of create the sense that smoking was normal, and that smoking was cool. And there's nothing inherent about how that happened, but they did that. They normalized and did that. So we ended up being able to put in place regulations that limited advertising to kids and fund through the tobacco companies hundreds of millions of dollars, billions, literally, of tens of billions of dollars of advertising to denormalize it. And the kind of ad we used was not one that warned you about smoking, but showed how, I think the most popular ad was one that kind of came in at a kid's eye level into a boardroom and saw these suits, laughing and just how they convince kids that somehow smoking is cool, then when what it really is just their way to make billions of dollars and kids get sick, and what suckers kids are. And that piss off kids, and they stopped smoking as a result. And so we have that success story. We know we can take on a powerful industry and succeed. We need to do that with food. And I think there are just some simple steps we can take. The first is the government should set as its goal of all of these nutrition and food programs is to ensure that every child in America reaches age 18 at a healthy weight and good metabolic health. It's just that should be on the number one gauge on their dashboard, and year over year they should look at that and take the steps they need to make sure that that's happening. And we're not telling them exactly how to do it, but just keep looking and make sure we're moving in that direction. That's what we achieved with tobacco. It kept, and today that's not happening. The government has programs that has a different goal. It just says, well, we're going to provide access to healthy food, and we're going to provide information. And they're on their dashboard as they're looking and saying, well, we can go into a store. Is the healthy food available? Might be hard to find. It might be over there in a corner, but yeah, there's a produce section. All right, check the box. Healthy food is available. Are there labels on the other food? Yep. Okay, check that box. We're providing access and information, so we've met our goal. Well, that's not really the goal, is to provide access and information. What you really care about is how sick our kids are. So make that your metric. And that's the number one thing that I think we need to do. And what I've fought for my career is to change the goal of the government. We're trying to do it this year in what's called the Farm Bill, that sets a lot of our food and agriculture policy, have the government set as its goal that it's going to look at how sick our kids are, what our kids' health, and judge how we're doing based on how that is. And then the way to achieve that are three simple things. We need to invest in more nutrition research. Two, the FDA needs to regulate the design of ultra-processed food. Don't trust the companies. Make them do the test to prove, and particularly they need to test and prove that the chemicals they're adding to food not only are safe in an old-fashioned way, that they don't cause a mutation in an animal that might give rise to cancer, but that you can eat these foods daily and they're not designed chemically to cause you to overeat and result in obesity. And the third is the USDA needs to really lean into its programs. It has an extraordinary budget, almost $200 billion in programs that feed 1 in 4 Americans each year. They really need to make sure that there are standards in all of those programs that say, yes, here's a government program, we're providing food, but the food needs to be food you can eat every day and stay well. And we don't really do that for most of those programs today.
Mm-hmm. What about forever chemicals? That's kind of a buzz phrase that I've heard a lot lately. Is that a real thing? What are forever chemicals?
Yeah, I mean, again, there are a lot of additives. This wasn't particularly in the packaging kind of chemicals. Forever is that they just stick around in the environment. Some things break down quickly. For example, most of the drugs we take have short half-lives, and they're sort of break down into harmless things. Some of the chemicals that end up particularly in packaging of food, turn out don't break down and persist in the environment for forever, essentially. So that's where they get their name. And again, I think what's changed is that our Congress passed a law in the 1950s, and it said that nothing that you add to food can cause cancer, and if it did, you can't add it to food. And it was called the Delaney Clause. It's still on the books today. But here's the problem. When it was passed, our ability to measure things in food was sort of at the parts per million ability. So looking at parts per million, there were very few of these chemicals in food, and we could get rid of them. A forever chemical is sort of an example of that. But then as time went on, we improved our analytical chemistry. We can measure parts per billion, even parts per trillion. And all of a sudden the FDA finds, well, all these chemicals are actually, we can't get rid of them. They're so common in the environment because our companies are using them for so many different purposes that we're all being exposed to them. But then the agency sort of said, well, Congress, what do you want us to do? We don't think you want us to start banning everything at this level. And so people started saying, well, there's sort of a de minimis level. Gee, if it's so low, it must be safe. Well, that's not necessarily true. You have to then do the science to find that out. And so I think our whole
But if it's forever in the environment, is it forever in our bodies too?
Well, it can be, unless your body has the ability to clear it out, it's there. And now our bodies are enormously resilient. The problem we have to keep in mind about our bodies is that they're designed through evolution. And evolution has one goal, laser focused, doesn't care about anything else. You need to reproduce and keep us going. That ends at pretty much 40. So our job as a body was designed over, 100,000 years or more to make sure that we can get to 40 and reproduce. And what happens to us after 40, our evolution just does not care. And so that becomes more and more of a problem for us. I've heard you talk before about life expectancy changing. And I've mentioned earlier, we talked about, how it's gone down. I think what people need to keep in mind about life expectancy numbers is how do they change? What drives them to change? And as I said, now they're going down because of chronic disease. For a long time, they were going up by a lot. So it used to be that your life expectancy was maybe 40 years. Now it's 80 years. Mm-hmm. What's misleading about that is, well, why was it 40? I'll give you an example. Alexander Hamilton, the former Treasury Secretary, been in the popular culture because of a play. His wife lived to be 97. And it shows that even back then, hundreds of years ago, people lived to old ages. They're just rare. The reason life expectancy numbers were so low wasn't that necessarily most people weren't living longer lives. It's just that a lot of people died early in life as infants. So if you have someone who lives to 97 and then you have someone who died in the first year of life, what's the life expectancy? It's, about 50, it's 48. And so
they were dying of like weird infections and like, we didn't have the medicine to cure.
Yeah. So you had a lot. So the ability, getting through the first year of life, getting through the first 5 years of life was tough. People had larger families because the usual experience of a family was that one of the child or more would die during childhood, either through an accident, a disease, an infection that we didn't know how to treat. And so that drove down life expectancy. So then you go to sort of modern times where as we've reduced those early deaths, there was a big jump forward because the numbers you're dividing, there are no more zeros, ones, twos you're putting in there. Everyone's leaving. And so you get that number moving further along and you have longer life expectancies. So, having people who lived a long time before just shows this is what the human body is capable of. We can live to an age or 100 or so. That's the sort of the outer limit based on what we know and the science we have. But then what drives life expectancy is at what point do people die over time? And when we made great progress, it's because we got rid of these early deaths. What's happening now, why it's declining, is it's not that these earlier deaths are returning, it's that people are getting sicker in middle age because of the food we're being sold, and those illnesses are shortening lives during middle age.
Yeah, because so back to kind of the tie this back together, like with the food we're eating and then the forever chemicals. Like, have you seen that video of the McDonald's meal, like the hamburger? It's like over time, like here's normal, patty of beef and a normal like hamburger bun, and it would just, the bun would mold, the beef would go. But the McDonald's one, it stays the same for like years, I think. How do they do? What is this preservative they're putting in there? And is this safe to put in our bodies?
Yeah, so I think people should be concerned about how our food's being designed, what goes into the food. I think the first concern has to be at the level of not the chemicals. If you look at why we're getting over the shorter lifespans, why it's declining, why people are getting sick with diabetes, obesity, heart disease, it is primarily from the amount of added sugar, saturated fat, salt that's in food. Now, what's unique about ultra-processed food is in nature, you don't get foods that are high in all three of those in one food. Nature might produce something that's high in saturated fat, or it's not added, but has natural sugars in it, so it's high in sugars, or some foods might even be high in sodium as individual foods. But as part of a diet, it balances out. What we find in ultra-processed food is not only are there being designed in a way that causes us to overeat, but they tend to be high in all of these nutrients that we know will make people sick if consumed in large amounts. So I think the first thing that you and your listeners need to be concerned about, and we can find some of that information on food labels today, the first thing that's making us sick is the sort of nutrient profile of the food
Sure.
that's made in a way where in one food you're getting so much sugar, saturated fat, and sodium together in one food that it makes us sick. Then I think chemicals are even maybe more of a concern in terms of how they're being used in flavors and smells and tastes that cause us to override the mechanisms of the brain that would get us to stop eating and that we keep eating.
Right, because
That
isn't
food.
that like what they did with Doritos is they put these artificial flavors in that make you just like makes your mouth just go, "Oh my God, this
Yeah,
is
no,
making
it's
me."
great. There's a book called The Dorito
Yeah,
Effect.
I wanna read
Again,
that.
because we don't invest in the science, we don't know if this actually is correct, the hypothesis or theory. But the theory goes that, as you know, as human beings, we're unique in that we're omnivores. We can live on whatever we find, which is part of our success. So some creatures depend on just a vegetarian diet. And if they lived in a world where all of a sudden it became tough to find plants, they were doomed. Or what some animals were carnivores, they needed meat. If they couldn't find that, they were doomed. So what an advantage we had as humans is that whatever we find as food, we can make it work for us. And so that gives us a great deal of flexibility in our food and what we eat. And we can eat a lot of different things and stay well. So that's an advantage we have. But then, somehow we need to go back. The main point you wanted to make was, remind me.
Well, we're talking about the McDonald's, like
Yeah, and so what
not being
happens in
able
the
to
McDonald's
disintegrate
and how
that?
it stays. Yeah, so people make the product and they put the additives in it so it has a longer shelf life. It's not so much that the additives are they can be, but I think in the scheme of things that are making us sick, the fact that a chemical might be just making us sick as a chemical is a concern. But the first things are these other larger ones with different nutrients
Well, I
involved.
just look, yeah, I just look at my parents and like a lot of people I know that are getting cancer and they're not eating too much. These people are underweight, if anything. So that they're man, they don't smoke. They didn't work in some sort of weird factory where they're exposed to so I it makes me concerned. I don't I'm not a
Yes,
scientist or
and
whatever, but yeah.
a key part of that is we're seeing a big uptick in cancer in young people, and that should
Yeah, my
alarm
buddy,
all of us.
my good friend's brother got leukemia, which is, and he again, I don't think he's obese. It wasn't a smoker, wasn't. I don't even think he was a big drinker.
Well, this is why we have, because what you're describing, I would describe as sort of things happen, right? In a country of over 330 million people, individual cases are warnings, but what is the what is the pattern that's really occurring out there?
Do you think
So
it's
any
biophosphate? Is that what it's called? The some of these pesticides and things that are being sprayed all over the fruits and vegetables. Is that safe?
Well, yes, in that I mean, again, so what I think is important for people to understand is, where are we applying the science, where are we applying our resources to protect people, and where are things that could be falling through the cracks. So we have laws. We require that the chemicals you're going to put on food are tested for causing certain diseases. Initiating a cancer is one of them. But there's another way that chemicals and other substances can affect the cancer, which is promoting the cancer. So once a tumor starts in your body, once you have this genetic defect where a cell starts reproducing in a way that would cause cancer, hopefully your immune system catches it and gets rid of it. And I think what people don't need to appreciate is probably often in your life, cancers are starting frequently, but your body has an immune system that takes care of them. There are other chemicals and substances in food, other things that could promote it. So once it starts, it might help it get hold and overcome your immune system. The problem is we're not doing the science and testing for promotion like we're doing for
Hmm.
initiation, right?
Oh, okay,
And then,
that's
as I
really
said,
interesting.
right, and so also chemicals might cause you to overeat. Now the number,
Yeah.
again, leukemia, is a more common childhood cancer. You may have relatives who've gotten cancers who are thin, but again, when we actually do the research, and this is why it's so important, because it's easy for us as people to see something. We're terrific, again, through evolution, to recognize a pattern, whether it really is the pattern or not. So as individuals, we see something and it reminds us, right? You touch the hot stove, we don't want to touch the stove again, whether it's hot or cold. So individually, we've learned through our own observation and we draw we're quick to draw connections from the things we see and say that this is what caused it. Now that's great and individually protects us to a degree, but overall, you may get the wrong impression, right? What you saw actually wasn't. It was something entirely different. So what we've been able to do as humans, as opposed to other species, is we develop language, we develop science, we develop all this knowledge that now allows us not just to rely on Chuck's experience or Jerry's experience and what we get
Right.
together and we've had the same experience and now we say this must be it. Well,
Right.
no, we've now developed a way that we can actually say that you and I can raise something and say, could it be this? And people take that information, they take it into our universities, they take it into our government, and then they can go out and they have the resources to get hundreds and thousands of people and ask them that exact same question. And then actually do the science to see, is what we observed actually what's happening, or is it
Right.
one off?
Well, yeah, I try to just take, what I read and what I see, what people are saying online or whatever. I take that and I put it into my computer of my brain, and I take my personal experiences. And then, I talk to people about this, and I look at people who are really healthy. Hey, what do you eat? What's your diet? And
Yeah.
I saw in the schools, I saw what all the kids that were eating the junk food, and their parents. I worked with a lot of parents that were massively overweight, and a lot of them were on disability and things. And I mean, so you can kind of start to put some of this together. What do you
Absolutely. But then I think what you need to do is take one additional step, which is to consult the literature and say,
Mhm.
has somebody actually studied this? And
No, I think it's definitely raises concerns of that we should look
right.
into
And so,
some of
as I
this
said,
stuff.
with school meals, what you said, what once was the case more, but today we do know that if you measure the quality of the school meals, they've gone from a 58 failing score to an 82. That's not to say, we need to do better, but then we can worry about that a little less than some other problems that we have. So I
What
think what you're talking about, these chemicals and such, I think the key takeaway is that, all right, so how do we assure the safety of chemicals, right? Because you come up with these
Sure.
examples that they're causing problems. And what should alarm people is that we count on the Food and Drug Administration, we count on the Environmental Protection Agency to set up systems that companies have to follow to make sure these chemicals are safe. And then you ask the question, are these systems working? And the answer you're going to find is they're not. And that's
Okay.
what should alarm people.
Yes.
So
I agree.
not that, gee, I've had this experience, there are these forever chemicals. Is this really causing a big problem in society? It's important to back up and say, well, what is the system do we have? Is this what we're looking at? Is there a system in place to catch
Yeah.
these things and prevent it? And what should alarm people is when they learn, for example, with chemicals in our food, that the FDA once had what was a loophole for rare circumstances, that they came up with something called generally recognized as safe
Right.
GRAS, where a few products, a few substances that had been in a long history of use got a pass and didn't have to submit all of the data to prove it was safe, because we're going to accept that it's been used for decades and people haven't seemed to be harmed by it. That was meant to be a loophole. That was not, loophole is maybe not the word, but just an exception that occasionally we would designate something as GRAS. Now you fast forward today and say, how are our chemicals, how are we to know that the chemicals going in food, not that any one of them is you can point to one or another and say, gee, this may be a problem. I read this may be a problem. The key thing is to back up and say, well, wait, what is a system that's testing these to assure that that all of them aren't problems, or in a systematic way we're catching it? And what you'd find is that we went from a system where companies had to prove their chemicals were safe before putting it in food to one where they get to self-certify that it's GRAS, and that virtually everything being put in our food today is going through this GRAS route that was meant to be an exception. That's what should alarm people.
Yeah.
Not
Definitely.
the one-off anecdote you read about, I saw this person ate that,
Well,
they
there's
got
so many
sick.
things. I mean, I just
It's
feel
what
like,
is the, right, we know we count on having certain systems in place that protect us, to
yeah.
allow us to go to bed at night
I
and not worry about these things. And what
I
should
would just
alarm people
right.
is we no longer have that for the
Yes.
chemicals in our food.
Well, and I just feel like if if you think of it like a jar, and like every chemical you put in your body, like the less that you can put in, the less that you're going to fill up that jar. I would rather have a jar of low chemicals. You can't avoid some of this stuff. I mean, it's in soaps, it's in deodorants, and I mean, it's hard to get police everything. And I mean, I'm sure there's harmful things about, doing this Zoom call with the technology and computers and the radiation. So I mean, it's just like the less that we can have of that, I feel like overall would be better. Like especially like our food, I feel like that's a big one to me.
I agree with you. I think that right. That you should be where we don't know, err on the side of caution, and
Yeah,
saying that we're going to take a be a little bit more careful here. But the key thing is for you and your listeners is that we have more power than we realize.
that's what I
Our
if I try to wake people up, if people get mad enough about this, then
Yeah, because we do it every day.
we'll
As you
change it
mentioned, our
overnight.
capitalist system, we all
Yeah,
buy stuff every day,
right.
and what we buy, companies pay
Right.
close attention to. Now
Look at, I
they're
mean, this is a
spending.
bad example, maybe, but look at Bud Light, whatever. I mean, you can agree or disagree with that boycott, but they changed stuff pretty quickly after that. I mean, there's a
Yeah,
lot of things like that. If people get mad, which
right.
this is something I feel like this isn't a partisan, political, religious issue. This is like a nonpartisan, like everybody should be upset about our food and that we should demand a higher quality of and a safer quality of food, in my opinion.
Right. Now, this is where the science and institutions become so important, because if people demand the right thing, then we get the results that are going to help. And I'll give examples. I know they are controversial for some, but I think it's important to see. So something like a genetically modified organism
Oh
or
yeah, I wanted to ask you about this.
right, GMOs, or also something gluten free. I don't know if you've ever seen a product or a menu, something called gluten free, which
Oh
refers
yeah,
to gluten. It's a protein that's in wheat
sure.
that there's an illness.
Celiac.
Yeah, where you're allergic, and it can be life or death. And then there's probably another couple percent of Americans, maybe up to 5 or so, that are sensitive and may get sort of GI
It seems like more
symptoms.
than that if you go on Instagram and you look
Well,
at,
that's
like,
right. And this is why the science becomes important, because if you just use word of mouth and anecdote, things may it's hard to know, is this affecting a lot of people? Is it making what's going on? It's why we have the ability to systematically collect the information, particularly now in the era of big data, where we have computers who can quickly compile huge amounts of data and see what's happening. And it's important we focus on the right things. People are right to be concerned about things, raise the flag, because
yeah.
if you're modifying the genetics of an organism, you could do something that's dangerous. So you want to make sure you test it. But see, companies are clever about they don't things that are simple to solve, that don't make like making a product that's gluten free. That's pretty straightforward and easy to do, and so they can just do that and then advertise it.
Well, what
Same
about
same thing with genetically modified. But my main point is that we know a great deal more about what's making us sick. The GMO is gluten free. There are issues there we need to stay on top of, but they have nothing to do with how sick we are as a population. They're
what
not the
about
reason.
is it genetically modified peanuts, or why are so many kids have peanut allergies? I mean, there were so many kids I worked with that had special plans in place
Well,
for peanut
this is why
allergies
we
that you
need
had
to invest in science, because anecdotally, people jump to conclusions. And the
yeah.
conclusion was that, gee, if I avoid peanuts, that's a way to avoid the allergy. And it turns out that no, your bodies work quite differently. The way you build a resilience that allow you to eat peanuts and not have an allergy is to expose people to it as a young age. But, people there would be reactions,
Well,
and
yeah,
some
because
people.
I think this one kid I specifically remember working with, that the kid ate peanuts for years, and then it was like on his 13th, it was on his birthday. He ate something and he had an allergic reaction, because it's something about when your body changes and when the kid's hormones kick in, somehow that creates the autoimmune response.
Well, what you're describing is in the work we do in academia. You do a large study with a lot of people, and then you plot it on a curve,
Mhm.
and you sort of see what the results are, what the response is. And a challenge is that, and then what you want, usually you get something what's called a bell curve, and you see a point where most of the responses are this. So I'll
Mhm.
use an example. We have these drugs now that help people lose weight. The
Ozempic,
GL,
yeah.
yeah, the GLP ones, like
What are
Ozempic
your
is.
thoughts on that? I'm not a fan of. I've
No,
cons-
I think they're. I mean, I think they're working, right. So they are
yeah,
helping people
but we
lose
don't know
weight,
the
and
long term effect. Remember
but we don't
fen?
know the long term effects. You're
Remember
exactly
Fen? That
right.
was the trendy drug. I don't know if you were around the FDA when that was approved.
But no, I wasn't. But here's the thing about it. So you do a study, right? You take a group of people who aren't on the drug, and
Hmm.
hopefully, and then a group of people are, and ideally, you design it in a way that they don't know whether they're on the drug or not. They're getting a shot every day. It's just that it's not, one has the drug, one has just salt water or something in it,
Right.
and so you don't know this, and then you reveal the results of your study. So let's say you do a study with thousands of people, and then you plot it on this curve and say, well, what happened to this person? How much weight did they lose, or their weight stayed the same, or did they even gain weight? And so when you do it on a population, any of these studies for thousands of people, what you found with these drugs is that you found this curve as the drug amount went up, and as you did it, most people started losing weight, and people started losing a great deal of weight, and even more importantly, they started being healthier. They started having less of some of these diseases. And so based on that data, you would approve the drug, and encourage people to take it, and people would benefit. But if you go back and look at that study, and you look out on what's called the tail, sort of the ends of what people experienced, and the distribution of the results, here's somebody who took the drug and gained weight, right?
Hmm.
And that happens with sort of all things in human systems. They're always what's called outliers.
Yeah.
And so you'll run across somebody, they're not making this up. They did something that, we're told that if you did this, this would happen. And they
Mhm.
did it, and just the opposite happened. They're not making it up. They're not lying to you. That actually happens because for whatever reason, the different events, their body, their genetics, their system got that opposite result, and it's real and valid and happened for them, but it's rare. And I think the key thing, what you're describing, is when you're setting policy, and you see and people bring to you an individual result, was that result an outlier, or was that result sort of the typical result you see? And I think that's where my work has been in public health, where my patient is the population, not the individual. And
Sure.
this is a really important point for people to consider. I chose that kind of work because in a way it's a lot easier. It's really clear to see if we do this in 1,000 people, what the
Mhm.
result will be for 950 of those people.
Right.
And so based on that, we can recommend that would be the policy. We should do this
Yeah.
because
Well, because yeah,
950.
wouldn't that if and I think that we agree, like with the ultra processed foods, like we could recommend that everybody should eat real food as opposed to less processed, as opposed to more processed. No one's benefiting from eating more processed food. I
Well,
guess
no, but you might. That's my point
unless you're
is
talking about
no, my
people
point
who
is you
can
might
afford it.
find, if when you do the study, you might find an outlier. For whoever reason, the person who ate the ultra processed food did better. Again, we don't
That
need,
is interesting.
just freaky things happen, right? We just
Yeah,
have
yeah,
to accept
sure.
that happens. The problem is if that's your guest on your show, and that they're speaking from the heart, this is the experience they really
Yeah.
had. But as a society, it's just we need to know, and this is why medicine, when is so hard, is it's really all that matters is for that individual. And when you have one patient, you have to kind of it works for most patients, but what happens if you do what works for most patients and you don't get that result? And that happens, not all the time, but it happens. And that's
Well,
what
that's what's
I
I
think
think
that's what
that
people have to
yeah,
sort out. What
right.
is the outlier? We don't want to rely on the
Different for everybody,
outliers.
right? I mean, because you do use that's what you're seeing online with all the Instagram and social media is like you're saying, hey, this guy's eating carnivore and he's and totally healthy and ripped. This guy's doing vegan and he's totally healthy and
Yeah,
ripped.
because with all the social media, all of these outlier individual cases are able to come to the forefront and speak with equal, sort of validity in terms of their own lived experience. And it's impossible, as someone watching it all, that they're telling you the truth in their
Yeah,
lived experience and that this actually happened to them. What we need, though, what people need to insist on is that we put in place, this is where we have the expertise and knowledge as humans, to then collect all that data and say, well, what happens in most people? And then
yeah,
that's an important point as well, because at the end of the day, the best we can do for you is I can say to you, Chuck, if you follow this diet, yeah, I get this question all the time. People tell me that, look, I'm struggling trying to follow a healthy diet. If you just sit me down and explain to me, this is a healthy diet, and if I eat the diet you're describing, I'm going to be able to live, and see my grandkids graduate from college. If you tell me that will happen, if you can promise me that, then I'm good and I'll be able to eat that diet, no problem. And my answer to them often always has to be the same, which is I say, look, if you take all your friends, all your family, and you can get me a number up to maybe 100 people or more, I can guarantee you that 90 of them will live longer and get to see the grandkids graduate from college. But there are 10 of you, I don't know, you could get
Yeah.
hit by a truck today
Yeah.
for whatever reason. And that's the thing, as a society, it's become harder and harder to sort out. What are the things, are you dealing with an outlier, or are you dealing with the main thing? But it's also a real problem. You, as individuals, all of us, when we hear advice, we hear this, it's still not a guarantee it works for us. It's a guarantee that it would work for most people. And
But some people, you could try these different things. I mean, I did vegan for 10 days.
yeah,
And I gained weight and I felt bloated, and I was like, this is not a good diet for me. Like, it just didn't work.
yeah. See, and that's a great example, because I did the same thing, and so I decided,
Yeah.
I tend to eat a healthier diet. I would describe
You're
it more as a
Mediterranean pescatarian.
yeah, I had a Mediterranean pescatarian diet. And so I was saying, well, that's worked for me. And then I was thinking, vegan. A lot of people say that there's a movie called Forks Over Knives, and
Yeah, I
a
saw
description. There's one about athletes who became vegan, and all of a sudden their performance was so much better. So, I was like, for fun, let me try it. Let me become a vegan. And so I did it for 6 months, and I did my blood work before I became a vegan and after. And in my case, there was just no difference. I felt the same. The difference was I was spending way too much time preparing my meals, and my family was complaining how much time I
Yeah.
spent preparing meals, because it's not readily available. You can't buy these foods easily. It takes a lot more work and preparation to make
And
it.
I noticed a lot of the vegan, at least for me, especially with the vegan restaurants, there a lot of those vegan foods, especially in the restaurants, are pumped full of sugar to make
Well,
it
they can be.
taste.
That's an
Sugar
important
is
point.
vegan.
Yeah, no,
So,
that's
but
an important point as well. The term vegan by itself is not sufficient. You have to go back to these macronutrients I was describing, the
right.
salt, sugar, fat. But then there are other examples. Former President Bill Clinton, Al Gore became vegans, and it saved their lives. And they've lived much longer lives than they might have if they hadn't. So you get those individual results. But then, and I think that's a key point you're making. I think for all of us, in the end, it's how does it affect you? For
Why do
me,
you think everyone is pushing vegan? Like Schwarzenegger's pushing it, and there was some MMA fighter that did it for a while. Then he lost the fights, and then he switched back to a meat-based diet. Like, why? And Bill Gates is, he really, the Impossible Burger. This was this big thing.
right.
Is there a big profit in vegan food?
It's not that it's a big profit. As I said, I think, again, I think for most people, if they move from a typical American diet to a vegan diet, they make changes in their food that are sort of the large changes we're recommending. So they start eating a lot less highly processed. They could, again, you point out,
Yeah.
could be more highly processed. And especially as the marketplace catches up, often what happens early on is that, these foods aren't available as highly processed packaged foods. And so if you want that, you have to do it. A better example is gluten-free. When, a lot of people, I think, say, well, gee, I went on a gluten-free diet. I felt a lot better. That's because when this first became a rage a bunch of years ago, the only way to go on a gluten-free diet was to stop eating refined carbohydrates, because they were all gluten.
Well, refined
Wheat-based.
carbohydrates was what we used to tell people. The food pyramid was eating like 6 to 11 servings
Well,
of
not
bread.
necessarily refined. It was
Yeah.
just carbohydrates, but we didn't make the distinction, right? We, as
Right.
as our science, we do learn more. People need to understand it's not that, gee, what we thought was wrong. If you go back and you listen to the scientists, they say this is what we know today. It seems to be this, but we don't have the full answer yet. This is a work in progress. So we're not saying for all time this is the right advice.
And wasn't that whole thing based on Ansel Keys' study of these different countries? But he left out left out some of the pieces of like with France. He left out that they eat a lot of saturated fat, but
Yeah, I think what you want to say about those is that all the scientists, including Keys, I've studied their work and such like that, are doing, really trying their hardest and best to come up with the answers. But they're working in a world where they're under-resourced. Government's not really supporting their research, but they're doing the best they can. They take the data they have and they see it and they say, this seems to be a pattern. And so we're doing that. But they're not able to, for example, the studies you really want to do, and this is really the challenge for all of us who work in the nutrition field. The study you want to do is a study, this sort of the gold standard of studies was what's called the randomized control trial. And so you take two groups of people, you put them in this, and you do one intervention with one group and one in the other. And even better if it can be blinded so the people themselves don't know which group they're in. Well, as you can think about that, that is really tough to do about how
Right.
people eat, right?
Well, especially
And
over time, right? So
yeah,
like
so we
you were
have in our
testing
national
and yeah.
National Institutes of Health. There's an investigator there, Kevin Hall, who's done a lot of the ultra processed food work. He has a facility where you can go there, live there, and he provides you all the food. So he knows with certainty what you ate and what you didn't eat. That is sort of the gold standard what we want to do. Problem is we don't fund him, and so the NIH gives him enough money to only have two beds, two beds, and
Mhm.
so he can only study two people at a time. Now, that's not enough to conclude anything, but if you want to study at least 100 people, which is a better number, for 6 months, he has to do two at a time, 50 times.
Yeah.
Right. And he can do them and they have to go one after another. So if you want to do it 6 months for 50 times, then it's going to take him 25, years to
Yeah.
do that study. Now, if he had a facility with 100 beds, he could do it in 6 months and he would be done. And so we don't invest in that. So because we don't invest in those kinds of studies, then people have to rely on getting a bunch of people, interviewing them and asking them what they ate. And the problem is we just don't remember. It's not that, some people lie, but other people just really don't remember. And then they collect all that data and it's flawed data because it's relying on what people recall. Now over time, we're getting better and better at it. So now we have the ability to also take some blood from them, measure certain things, and we can tell that, gee, what you said you ate, and we're looking at your blood, that's clearly not what you ate. And so you're just not remembering because you just wouldn't get that result in your blood if that's what you actually ate. So we need to come up with that. And now we have the microbiome, which is the bacteria in your gut that we can measure as well. So we're getting better and better tools. So I think the way to think about it is our nutrition knowledge is steadily improving. And it's not that things we once thought turn out to be completely wrong. It's just that our understanding of it has evolved in a more nuanced way. And so now we need to understand that. And fat's a great example. We started off worrying that fat was a problem, but that's because here's the counterfactual. What we had is a National Institute of Health that had a heart institute, a cancer institute, a diabetes institute. It was doing no independent nutrition research. The nutrition research they were doing was in the heart, the cancer, and the diabetes institute. I don't know if you've ever heard of a phrase where you say that if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail.
No, that's a great saying.
Well, it's sort of like that. So at the time, in the Keyes time and others, the experts who, at the National Institutes of Health, turns out that one of the institute directors were more interested in diet than all the others. It was a gentleman, Claude Lafont, who led the Heart Institute. And so he spent more time at his institute than those at the cancer, diabetes, or other institutes looking at how food is affecting heart disease. And so it ended up that as a nation, our top scientists in the heart area, we were most focused on the effect that food was having in heart disease. And when they looked at that in isolation, it seemed to line up initially about the amount of fat that people was eating. That was a correct observation. They needed to, if they had looked a little harder and longer, they would have seen that it's not just fat, it's a little more nuanced. It's more the saturated fat. And they're actually healthy and unhealthy fats. And so you want good fats, bad fats. But they
What
started
about the
off thinking,
source of fat? Because I mean, people
yeah,
say
the source of fat, all of these
it
things
comes
sort
from a
of.
meat. I feel like that's pretty natural, but what are your thoughts on seed oils? Because that's a big thing too, that they say that the way they're making this oil, it's like a 6-step process. This oil was supposed to be for an engine lubricant. Now people are digesting it. And
Yeah, see, this is where, Chuck, we could talk all day because people start off with some other. So the notion that somehow seed oils are making us sick is not true. We've studied it. That is not a true statement. What is true is that among unsaturated plant-based oils, there are different types. There's what's called omega-6, which tends to be more in some of these seed oils, and there's omega-3, which are things like in fish oils, but also some of the other plant oils like olive oil. And so what's important is that there's a ratio between the omega-3s and 6. You need to have enough omega-3 in your diet to balance that ratio so that the omega-6 are fine. If you don't have the omega-3 and don't just have the omega-6, that can be more of a problem. And so that's, it's not that people should be eating less. The answer is not to eat less of the omega-6. The answer is you need to make sure you're getting and eating enough of the omega-3s and getting that right ratio. But omega-6 actually are healthy when they're eaten in the right ratio with other healthy oils. But again, because we don't do the science fully to begin with. And had we done it back in Ansel Keys' time, if the head of the Diabetes Institute was as engaged as the head of the Heart Institute, he would have been, and they were all in the room together, which they never were. What you would have learned was that the Heart Institute, I'm just looking at my clock, and I need to run to another meeting in a minute here. So let me just interrupt. Sorry, just to check what time that is.
No, that's fine. Yeah, I can let you go. I could go on forever. I have like a million.
Yeah, I got to run now. So let's take that up again sometime. But this was great talking with you. Seed oils are not the problem. The problem is people aren't getting enough of the omega-3 oils to balance that out. We need to eat both. And the biggest overarching problem is we're not investing enough in the science to get solid answers. And then we have to result in people's anecdotal experiences. And that's a big problem.
What about one last thing before I let you go? What about this idea? This is my idea, and you have connections, so maybe you can make this happen. I call it the Food Visibility Act. We have to know not only what's in the food and descriptions of the ingredients and what they are, but also the processing, whether it's GMO, lab grown, organic, non-organic, what kind of pesticides are given.
I got to run, but let me tell you, what we do need to do is I helped update the nutrition facts label.
Okay.
We need a better ingredient label. The ingredient list today does not provide us accurate information about what's in our food. And it leaves a lot out, the flavors that they're using, the chemicals, they don't even have to disclose those. We need to update the ingredient list to provide the information you're saying. With that, I got to run, but great to talk to you.
We'll have to have you back on. Thanks again.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.